At the edge of space, where the atmosphere turns black and violet, America believed it owned the sky. May 1, 1960, a U-2 spy plane soars at 70,000 feet, a silver ghost photographing Soviet missile sites no one else could touch. They said nothing could reach it, nothing could bring it down. Then came the flash. A single Soviet missile, fired at the absolute limit of its range, tore through the silence. The aircraft shattered. The pilot, Francis Gary Powers, ejected into the unknown, parachuting slowly toward capture, interrogation, and a trial that would nearly ignite the Cold War. He was never supposed to survive. He was never supposed to exist.
In the early 1950s, the United States wasn't just fighting the Soviet Union, it was fighting silence. After World War II, the world split in two, and the Soviet side slammed its borders shut. No press, no observers, no overflights. What lay beyond the Iron Curtain was a void, one filled with rumors, fear, and worst-case assumptions. American intelligence didn't know how many long-range bombers the Soviets had. They didn't know how fast their missile program was advancing. They didn't even know where many of the factories and airfields were located. And in the nuclear age, not knowing was deadly. Military planners warned of a looming bomber gap. The belief was that the Soviet Union was secretly mass-producing nuclear-armed bombers, hundreds, possibly thousands, capable of crossing the Arctic and striking American cities with little warning. Later came whispers of an even more terrifying possibility: intercontinental ballistic missiles, hidden somewhere in the vast Siberian wilderness, waiting silently for a launch order. Every one of these fears pushed the United States closer to a catastrophic mistake. To fill the intelligence vacuum, the U.S. turned to aerial reconnaissance. Modified bombers like the RB-47 were sent probing the edges of Soviet airspace, skirting borders, testing reactions. Sometimes they crossed the line. When they did, the response was swift and brutal. Soviet radar tracked them, fighters intercepted them, crews were killed or captured. Each mission that failed made the message clearer: traditional aircraft were obsolete against a modern air defense network. The Iron Curtain wasn't just political, it was physical. By the mid-1950s, the Soviet Union had constructed a layered defense system: early warning radar stretching thousands of miles, interceptor aircraft guided from the ground, and anti-aircraft guns guarding critical cities. Any plane flying at conventional altitudes was living on borrowed time. The CIA faced an impossible question: how do you spy on a nation that won't let you in without starting a war? The answer couldn't be faster aircraft. Speed could be chased, fighters could be scrambled, missiles could be developed. So intelligence planners flipped the problem upside down. What if the aircraft didn't need to outrun the Soviets? What if it simply flew above them? At the time, this idea bordered on science fiction. The highest flying operational aircraft struggled past 45,000 feet. Above that, engines lost thrust, wings lost lift, pilots lost consciousness. Even if a plane could reach those heights, it couldn't stay there long enough to be useful. But there was a narrow band, an unexplored frontier, where the atmosphere thinned just enough to cripple interceptors and radar tracking became unreliable. A place where no Soviet weapon was believed to function effectively. If an aircraft could live there, not dash through it, but operate there, it could see everything. The CIA didn't want a bomber, they didn't want a fighter, they didn't even want a military aircraft. They wanted a ghost, something so high, so slow, and so fragile that it defied every assumption of air combat. Something that ignored the rules of survivability and replaced them with a single radical idea: height is armor. To build it, they would have to abandon traditional design philosophy, accept extraordinary risk, and trust that the Soviets were wrong on one crucial thing: that the upper edge of the atmosphere was a sanctuary. And so, quietly, without congressional approval, without Air Force ownership, and without public knowledge, the CIA went searching for someone willing to attempt the impossible.
They found him in a small Lockheed facility in Burbank, California, where a group of engineers known only as the Skunk Works were about to design the strangest airplane ever flown.
Kelly Johnson didn't design the U-2 to survive combat. He designed it to avoid combat entirely. At Lockheed Skunk Works, Johnson and his team threw out nearly every assumption of military aviation. Speed was secondary, strength was a liability, armor was dead weight. The only metric that mattered was altitude, and altitude demanded sacrifice. The result barely looked like an airplane. The U-2's wings stretched 80 feet from tip to tip, longer than a B-52's, but they were razor thin, flexing several feet up and down in turbulence. On the ground, they sagged under their own weight. In the air, they bent and breathed, more like a sailplane than a jet-powered spycraft. Those wings gave the U-2 incredible lift, allowing it to float in air so thin that most aircraft simply stopped flying. The fuselage was little more than a tube. To save weight, the aluminum skin was so thin that ground crews were warned never to lean against it. Step in the wrong place, and your boot could punch straight through the aircraft. There was no redundancy, no excess structure, only what was absolutely necessary to climb higher than anyone thought possible. Even the engine was a compromise. The Pratt & Whitney J75 turbojet had been designed for brute force, but in the U-2, it was tuned and optimized to sip oxygen at extreme altitudes. At 70,000 feet, it produced a fraction of its sea level thrust, yet it had to run flawlessly for hours. A flameout up there wasn't just an emergency, it was a death sentence. But the true miracle of the U-2 wasn't how high it flew, it was what it carried. Inside the fuselage sat the Type B camera system, a technological marvel that bordered on absurd. Weighing nearly 450 pounds, it held almost 2 miles of film and used lenses of unprecedented clarity. From 13 miles above the Earth, it could photograph airfields, missile sites, and industrial complexes in breathtaking detail, clear enough to count aircraft, measure runway lengths, and identify construction stages. It didn't take pictures, it harvested intelligence. Every flight returned with thousands of frames, raw truth in an age of guesswork. Analysts pored over the images with magnifying glasses, turning shadows into measurements and rumors into facts. Entire Cold War strategies were rewritten based on what that camera revealed. But the U-2's greatest strength was also its greatest danger. At altitude, the aircraft flew in a narrow, unforgiving envelope known as the coffin corner. Fly too slowly, and the wings would stall, dropping the aircraft into an unrecoverable fall. Fly too fast, and shock waves would form over the wings, threatening structural failure. The margin between the two, sometimes as little as 5 knots, was all the room a pilot had. 5 knots for 9 hours. There was no room for distraction, no room for fatigue, no room for error. And because the air was too thin to sustain life, the pilot flew inside a pressurized cockpit while wearing a full pressure suit, an astronaut's outfit years before NASA made it famous. If the cabin lost pressure, unconsciousness would come in seconds, death would follow shortly after. The U-2 was not forgiving, it was not strong, it was not fast, but it could climb into a realm where the rules of air combat simply stopped applying. And for a brief window in history, that made it the most valuable aircraft ever built. The Dragon Lady had been born. Now it needed to be hidden. The U-2 was born in shadows, and that's where the CIA intended to keep it. To maintain total secrecy, the project was hidden even from the military's own oversight. Testing took place at a remote, dried-up lakebed in the Nevada desert, a site known only by its coordinates, but which would later gain worldwide notoriety as Area 51. The pilots weren't active-duty military. They were sheep-dipped, civilians on paper, but elite aviators in reality, recruited from the Air Force and given new identities. They were trained to fly a plane that was as temperamental as it was groundbreaking, under a cover story that claimed they were flying high-altitude weather research missions for the National Advisory Committee on Aeronautics. By 1956, the Dragon Lady was ready for its true purpose. The first overflights of the Soviet Union were a revelation. In a single mission, the U-2 could collect more intelligence than years of traditional espionage. It revealed the truth about the bomber gap. It didn't exist. The Soviets were bluffing, inflating their numbers to hide their weaknesses. The U-2 saw through the lies, providing President Eisenhower with the one thing he needed most: certainty. For 4 years, the U-2 operated with impunity. Every flight was a gamble, a high-wire act over a nation that knew the plane was there but couldn't reach it. Soviet leaders were furious, watching helplessly as American ghosts drifted across their skies, photographing their most sensitive secrets. They poured resources into new radars, faster interceptors, and more powerful surface-to-air missiles. The sanctuary of the upper atmosphere was shrinking. The CIA knew the clock was ticking, that eventually the Soviets would catch up. But for a brief, critical window, the U-2 held the line, preventing a nuclear war born of misunderstanding and fear. It was a triumph of engineering and audacity, but as the 1960s dawned, the era of the ghost was about to come to a violent, world-changing end.
At 70,000 feet, there was only the pilot. Francis Gary Powers was chosen because he was ordinary, disciplined, and methodical, capable of enduring long hours of isolation without drifting. A former Air Force captain, he was recruited by the CIA and stripped of his uniform. Officially, he was a civilian, deniable, disposable, and politically explosive if captured. Training for the U-2 was brutal. Takeoffs required precision, and landings were controlled crashes. At high altitudes, the autopilot was unreliable, forcing pilots to hand-fly the aircraft with constant microscopic corrections for hours. Before missions, Powers wore a stiff, heavy pressure suit and breathed 100% oxygen to prevent decompression sickness. Inside the cramped cockpit, there was no relief, just endurance, with meals squeezed through tubes. Powers carried a final instruction, a silver dollar containing a needle coated in fast-acting saxitoxin poison. He was also warned of the propaganda and show trials that would follow capture. The U-2 was equipped with a self-destruct mechanism to ensure nothing of value survived a crash. There was no rescue plan or escort. The mission relied entirely on the belief that nothing could touch him. By 1960, Powers was highly experienced in deep penetrations of Soviet airspace. His next assignment was an ambitious flight across the USSR from south to north to photograph sensitive military sites. On May 1, 1960, he took off from Pakistan, believing he was flying above history. He was actually flying directly toward it.
On May 1, 1960, the U-2 Dragon Lady prepared for Operation Grand Slam in Peshawar, Pakistan. This 2,900-mile mission, the most ambitious ever approved, tasked Francis Gary Powers with flying across the Soviet Union to photograph missile test ranges, nuclear facilities, and industrial cities before landing in Norway. Powers climbed to 70,000 feet, with the aircraft balanced on a knife edge in the thin air. As he crossed the USSR, the Type B camera system successfully captured high-resolution images of secret sites like Turatom and Sverdlovsk. While the first few hours were flawless, the flight triggered a furious response from Nikita Khrushchev, who ordered the aircraft destroyed at any cost. Soviet air defenses went on full alert.
Interceptors were scrambled, including an unarmed Su-9 pilot ordered to ram the U-2, but they could not reach Power's altitude. However, the Soviets deployed a new weapon, the S-75 Dvina surface-to-air missile. Unlike jets, these radar-guided missiles could reach extreme heights and used proximity fuses to destroy targets without a direct hit. As Powers approached Sverdlovsk, he had no warning as a white plume of a missile accelerated toward him. For the first time, the Dragon Lady was no longer alone or safe above the battlefield. The first S-75 missile detonated behind the U-2, sending a shockwave that tore away the tail section. The aircraft, designed for lift rather than structural strength, immediately came apart at 70,000 feet. Inside the cockpit, total chaos ensued as the plane entered a violent flat spin, pinning Francis Gary Powers against the canopy with intense G-forces. As the altimeter spiraled down to 30,000 feet, the spinning slowed enough for Powers to act. He couldn't use the ejection seat because his legs were wedged under the instrument panel, so he manually released the canopy. The resulting decompression sucked him out of the disintegrating aircraft. He drifted down under his parachute, watching the wreckage of the secret plane fall toward the Soviet countryside. Though he carried a silver dollar containing a lethal poison needle, he chose not to use it. Powers landed alive in a field and was immediately captured by local farmers and military personnel. The Dragon Lady was destroyed, the pilot was a prisoner, and the Cold War had reached a dangerous new turning point.
Powers was made the subject of a showcase trial.
Following the U-2's disappearance, Washington issued a meticulous cover story claiming a NASA weather plane had drifted off course. However, Nikita Khrushchev let the Americans lie 3 times before revealing the truth. The U-2 was shot down, the pilot was alive, and the cameras were intact. This revelation caused the 1960 Paris summit to collapse and forced President Eisenhower into a humiliating admission of deliberate espionage. The incident proved that the U-2 was not untouchable and that high-altitude immunity was an illusion. Consequently, the CIA accelerated the development of the Mach 3 Blackbird Oxcart and the first spy satellites to conduct surveillance without risking human lives. For Francis Gary Powers, the consequences involved intense interrogation and psychological pressure to reveal U.S. secrets. His refusal to divulge sensitive information beyond the bare minimum made him emblematic of the human cost of espionage. Ultimately, the incident ended the era of safe high-altitude overflights and permanently altered Cold War diplomacy, technology, and strategy.